What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Mark Russell.
I'm Charles Figley.
And we're glad that you joined us. This is, I believe, episode 6. And then we're still diving into this chapter 2 of our book, Psychiatric Casualties, where we're really trying to get a handle on the scope of these mental health crises and what all kind of goes into a crisis in military mental health care.
What would be the topic that you would be most interested in, Mark? I mean, we have spectrum of neuropsychiatric diagnoses, but we kind of covered that.
Yeah, I mean, just again, that whole idea that it's a lot more than just PTSD. But yeah, something that we didn't discuss, and it's worth mentioning, is what are called cultural idioms of distress. I know you're familiar with that, but for the listeners who may not be, cultural idioms of distress is a jargon type term that really refers to the fact that people of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, sometimes different status, there are kind of unwritten rules in what is appropriate to how to express distress and suffering. And what is not appropriate in ways to disclose how we're feeling or what's bothering us. And these are referred to as cultural idioms of distress. They're idioms unique to either a group of people or people of a certain, again, ethnic, racial background or social class or things of that sort. And I think in the military, how I see that kind of manifested is, of course, the military is a social microcosm of broader society. So you get people of all walks of life, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different racial, ethnic, sexual identity, etc. And the research has shown that some people of certain ethnic groups, for example, are more prone to express their distress, their stress symptoms, their uneasiness in physical means. And that would be like through headaches or fatigue or sleep difficulties or sometimes irritability, to gastrointestinal, to all those medically unexplained symptoms we talked about in the previous episode. And I would say that's true in general with the military as well. I think military culture, because there's such stigma about talking about mental health, problems or admitting that we're having some kind of emotional or psychological issue, is that it's easier for us to talk about, I'm tired, I'm not sleeping good, I have headaches, I have chronic pain, I have some high blood pressure, something going on cardiovascular wise, right? You name the organ system, there's a symptom for it, right? And those are things that many of us are more likely to disclose or to talk about to a healthcare provider than we are psychological symptoms. Is that something you come across in your vast years of experience as well, Charles?
Oh yes, without a doubt. A lot of that. And interesting too, because there is a symptom and then it's explained away. Another symptoms,
right. Yeah, I mean, and the explanations, like for a lot of medically unexplained symptoms, are conditions like irritable bowel or GERD or chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia, idiopathic seizures, things, just again, all of which convey that there's not a firm medical or physiological etiology, a cause, but that these are, again, medically generally medically unexplained physical symptoms that are often manifestations of stress.
Yeah. Yeah, I had no idea that I had dyshidrosis. It's kind of a drying of the hands, etc.
Yes.
When I was a kid, I would get, my I guess the skin is worn down because the little boils, in terms of dyshidrosis, the boils would come out. Not that many, it depends, but it was really associated with stress.
Yep.
And when I played outside and maybe it was wet a little bit, it would do more damage. But I had no idea until I was an adult and I had some periods of stress. Being in the Marine Corps certainly would be stressful, and discover, oh, my hands are doing it again. But it would go away when in periods in which everything is fine. And so that's an example that's not going to be in any kind of report of any kind of stress.
Not at all. And it's so highly prevalent, these physical, unexplained kind of medical symptoms, somatic symptoms. And, everyone's heard the term psychosomatic. And in today's vernacular, we kind of look at psychosomatic as conveying something that's illegitimate. Like it's a pseudo suffering. It's maybe faking, it's exaggerating, right? They're made up. They're fictional illnesses that people have made up because of their psyche or their psychological symptoms. But the origin of the term actually goes back like 1847. And it's to blur the two. It comes out of Greek, psychosomatic, and it combines the word psyche with somatikos. To really, it was meant and intended. Its origin was the mind and body as being inseparable and interchangeable. So psychosomatic was meant to be not a pejorative of weakness, but was to state a medical scientific fact that the mind and body are one, and what affects one part of the body, mind, is going to affect the other, right? So there's more of a holistic view. And as we talked about in previous episodes, that was the dominant medical legal paradigm of traumatic stress, was that it was psychosomatic, it was genuine suffering. And, what was referred to then as traumatic neurosis, for example, shell shock earlier on in the First World War. But in 1916, as we talked about, during the First World War, due to the epidemic of people who were leaving the battlefield due to these psychological manifestations of stress, led to the outlawing of this holistic view. And psychosomatic started becoming more pejorative of it's a made up, it's a fictional illness. Similar to what we referred to back then as hysteria.
There have been a number of concepts similar to that, hysteria being an example.
Yeah, well, it's just something I just throw out there that there's a lot we just don't know about the whole mind-body connection, because we have, through science, typically kind of reduced the things of the mind and psyche in one discipline, and then things of the body and medicine as separate. And so there's this dualism of mind and body that kind of suggests that things of the mind, of the psyche, are not quite as real or genuine as the suffering from an illness or injury to the body itself. But again, psychosomatic was meant to bridge term that says, look, the thing, illnesses and suffering and injuries of the mind are just as legitimate as to the body. I wish we go back to that time.
Yeah, good luck with that.
You would think, right?
We can talk about the prevalence of personality disorders. I think one of the, I think this was our effort to find little known facts and share it with you all, to be able to, we've covered everything here as far as we know, but there are numbers of things that we are covering that probably not that many people are aware of. And that's one of the specific reasons why we did this. So grief reactions is an example of that. But traumatic brain injury is another that is it certainly for me, it emerged within my own area of, well, now personalities wasn't there an effort to get people out of the military and they called it personality disorders?
Oh, yeah, that's been going on for centuries, actually. But for the military, personality disorder or characterological disorders are determined to be unsuitable for active duty service. So if you're diagnosed in the military with a personality disorder, chances are high that you're going to be administratively separated due to unsuitability. And we refer to that as the backdoor discharge. And we're not the only ones. The Government Accountability Office has been steep in that as well, and holding the DOD accountable for mislabeling combat veterans as personality disorder and separating them with sometimes with either general or other than honorable discharges, which at that time made them ineligible for VA healthcare. So these would be people, men and women, who had entered the military with no evidence that they had any kind of psychological problems before they came in. And the enlistment exams were clean, so they were, went through basic training, went through all their other trainings, and some of them served years, even decades in the military, and then were deployed and started exhibiting problems in their behavior, anger that was either given to their officer or senior enlisted, in terms of disrespect, or they would go unauthorized absence. They would start using alcohol or drugs, get into being arrested for different, acts that were that were uncharacteristic of them. But then they would see someone like me and in the military, and they would be labeled as personality disorder. And then again, most times separated from service. And I still see that. Again, I do the VA disability exams. I'm seeing people diagnosed with personality disorder with 3 combat tours from Iraq. And now suddenly they're unsuitable. Yeah.
Un-American.
Well, it is. And it's an it's basically, in a way, kind of weaponizing psychiatry.
Yes.
To how do you get rid of people now who you find to be a pain in the butt, who are acting out and are not following the rules and regulations. And again, sometimes, commanders are in a tight spot, right? They have to do something for the morale and welfare of the unit, et cetera. They can't let people just, start smoking marijuana again on active duty and not have any consequences. But in many cases, these people are not given help. They're not identified as having any issues except their behavior, their conduct now, and they're separated out unfairly.
And still are. That's the remarkable thing. It continues to this day.
Oh, it absolutely continues. Now there are some rules in place that have, because these government studies have kind of clamped down on the military's use of these backdoor discharges. And we're going to talk more about this in subsequent episodes. But so there are some limitations put on commanders that now they have to offer mental health evaluations for people who are going through potential personality disorder or kind of unsuitability type evaluations. So there are a little more guardrails, but it's still, we're talking about human beings, so that it's not bulletproof or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was looking for there was a quote that I'm kind of trying to find. I wish I had that, but it was coming from the Institutes of Medicine, which is, for those who don't know, the Institutes of Medicine is the kind of medical watchdog for the government, for the U.S. government. And they're the agency that is appointed to investigate and research on controversial subjects to help develop policies on healthcare, for example. And they looked and did an exhaustive study on the effects of stress, protracted stress, and its effects on human beings. And, the whole idea of medically unexplained symptoms that we talked about, or war syndromes, or psychosomatic illnesses, and that sort of thing. And I don't see, let me see if I can find that quote, but if not, I'll just kind of give my clip version of it. Now, here we go. So this was their conclusion finding. This was, I think, published in 2006 by the Institutes of Medicine. Quote, chronic stress can lead to adverse health outcomes that affect multiple body systems, such as the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, endocrine, immune, gastrointestinal, and cardiovascular symptoms. And basically, every organ system is affected by this effect of stress. And the more chronic, the more extreme and traumatic the stress, the more profound these physical, effects are. So, they talk about, the Institutes of Medicine too, that there are structural changes that happen in the body and in the brain as a result of these, protracted exposure to stress. So it kind of belies this kind of notion of hysteria, or what we now call psychosomatic, of that the issues with the psyche, that stress, psychological problems are not really real suffering and legitimate, like in terms of an injury to the body, for example. It's easier to delegitimize it. So I taught graduate school for a while after I got out. And one of the things I was teaching on this topic of stress in the body and trauma, etc., was I used the example of Walter B. Cannon. That ring a bell?
Yes, sure.
Right. So Walter B. Cannon, it was an American psychiatrist, and he coined the term fight or flight. That whole fight or flight was from Walter B. Cannon. Well, Walter B. Cannon was an American Army psychiatrist during the First World War. And he went to understand, how did good, well-sounded, physically healthy, mentally healthy men and women come in the military? They're exposed to this, protracted stress, traumatic stressors, and how did they break down? Why did they break down? So that led him, after the First World War ended, led Walter B. Cannon to go back to Harvard, I think, and study the effects of stress. And one of the ways he went to investigate and came up with fight or flight was he examined what are called voodoo death. You know anything about voodoo death? Well, you could probably imagine it. In some cultures, if a witch doctor or somebody cursed you and said you're going to die, that many times these people would die who were otherwise physically healthy, and they would die suddenly. And so, there weren't a lot of examples of voodoo death in the United States. So Walter B. Cannon then looked at sudden death experiences in America. And you can find, and I show my students all these newspaper clippings of people of good physical health, nothing going on physically or psychologically, who would suddenly die either in a roller coaster, or something frightened them, such as a movie, or seeing a dog, or any kind of a very frightening, terrifying experience for somebody, and they suddenly die. And the sudden death is what it's referred to. And what the coroners all conclude was that these people were healthy and they should not have died. But it was the effects of acute, intense stress that stopped their heart. So my question to the students would be like, well, if something could kill you and stop your heart, is that a legitimate injury? Is that real? Right? And so I think a lot of people, they were kind of skeptical where I was going with that, but they kind of led me, well, I never thought of it that way, right? That, well, maybe this thing with stress is is legitimate, and they really can cause stress injuries that are as legitimate and profound as physical injuries. After all, it could kill you.
Yes. No, that's very profound. I have nothing to add to that.
Yeah, I don't know why I just throw that in there. I felt I kind of got back into my college teaching days, but it's for me it just stood out because I have long languished over the idea that mental health has struggled to find legitimacy. Like things that were mental or psychological were less meaningful, less injurious, less legitimate than physical medicine and physical injuries. And that I think that's a tone that we strike in the book, that until we get the mind body dilemma, until we correctly conclude and go back probably to a more holistic, true psychosomatic version of understanding health, we're always going to be dividing the things artificially that people with psychological injuries are always going to get the short end of the stick.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking that I discovered psychoneuroimmunology as a field.
Yes.
I thought that was it. Oh, here we go. Here will be
Right.
the evidence, etc. And they've gone a long way, and certainly the analysis is there, the conceptualization. But I don't know, has it made a difference?
Yeah, no, I know there was efforts in the DOD. I think of Army General Peter Corelli, who was trying to change the diagnosis from PTSD to PTS, post-traumatic stress,
Would be great.
or PTS injury.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a term that you and I use
Yes.
in our writings about war stress injury or traumatic stress injury. Injury in the sense that it's, again, legitimate as any physical injury that we experience, and as it should be.
There was a penetration. There was an assault.
Yeah, that very much so.
Yeah. Well,
right.
We talked about traumatic grief. What about we talk about traumatic brain injury?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that. It would really unnerve me when I was kind of going, as a Navy psychologist on active duty during the whole mental health crisis here, was the DOD and their experts kept coming back to Congress and publishing that, that they call signature injuries of this war in Iraq and Afghanistan were traumatic brain injury, and signature in the sense that these were unpredictable. It was all due to this asymmetric guerrilla warfare using input IEDs, right? And that the traumatic brain injuries, again, were not something that we could have predicted and we couldn't have prepared for. And that TBI had become kind of a new modern injury due, to modern guerrilla, again, asymmetrical warfare.
And do you believe that?
No, I mean, that's what burned me up about it, is that you can go back, and we go back to the records of Napoleon. And his Surgeon General talked about what I call wind contusions, which were, a precursor to what in the First World War was called shell shock, right? Which were every bit, or we talked about in the 1860s during the trauma pension debates, what we call railway spine or railway brain, accidents that were caused during railway accidents due to this violent commotion that shook the brain and call it injury to the brain, right? TBI, as we call it today. So, it's been, anytime there's been large blasts or violent commotion like you see in warfare, there's always been concussive effects, and those have always been identified. And it was until, again, this modern approach was like, this was unique. It snuck up on us. We had no way of understanding we needed to start screening for traumatic brain injury until well into the war, until Congress got involved and the media got involved about traumatic brain injury. Now suddenly we view this as a kind of a new phenomena in the military, which is ridiculous.
Sad.
It
And
is.
substance use disorder,
Yeah. Lots of it.
that's a main, that's a
Yeah.
main issue in terms of the dark side of military mental health. The lack of attention to it, the buying beer. I mean, I remember very well. It was even before Vietnam. I was in Hawaii at Pakaloa, I think, in the Big Island, and they were passing out beers. Okay,
Oh, yeah.
but I traded those for Cokes because I wasn't into beer yet in that
Yeah.
regard. And it's just sort of amazing. Cigarettes, another example in which it was issued. Here you go. Here's your rations and here's your cigarettes. I mean, it's
Oh, that was the norm, wasn't it? It was.
nuts, nuts.
I mean, I came in '79, in the Marine Corps, and I remember very vividly out of basic training when I got to my first duty station and going to the barracks, and I could smell pot everywhere, and there's beer cans everywhere. And thinking, again, this is post-Vietnam effects, and at that time there was no drug testing policy, right? That came later I think later in the early '80s, due to aircraft accidents and other incidents where people were under the influence, right? But yeah, and today again, substance use is widely prevalent. Obviously, not as much the drug use, but still even that, and including prescription drugs. But we treat it as often we treat it as separate. Like when people come in for a substance use evaluation in the military, there's not very much discussion or effort to understand why is the person abusing the substances, right? What are the stressors, the things that might be underlying that substance abuse, and and addressing that as well. Now, some of that is done, but in large part, that's not routine, and it ought to be, right?
Well, we talked about this already in numbers of sessions, but there's an understaffing, acute understaffing, and so therefore there's a lot of moving around of parts in order to make do and the semblance of a full.
Yeah, I mean that's no question. That's a huge problem, and that contributes to that. A lot of these issues about not identifying and so on. But as well as even when you have staffing, is that there is inadequate training, of mental health providers in general, but in the military as well, to really kind of look beyond the symptoms, if you would, and really try to understand the person and what's going on, what's the motive, and what are some things. And sometimes it's just that they're addicted to the substance, and it's not necessarily something traumatic or something that had to do with their deployments or whatnot. But that ought to be kind of routine, at least when we are evaluating these people, that we're not just addressing the symptoms, we're addressing also the underlying causes too.
It's interesting because I've certainly in the military, I talked about this a little bit in terms of alcohol, substance abuse.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I've noticed being not in the military necessarily, but in the academy, when you go to try to interview people to come, like we're looking for a new dean now, you maybe have a drink. Some people drink. You and I go out, we have a beer, et cetera, et cetera. But I've noticed that that's changed a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Over time. I think that's a good thing, frankly. And I'll bet you that even if they don't drink at the table, they'll go home and drink, probably, maybe.
Yeah.
I know I don't. I drink much, much less. I mean, a half a beer at most.
Yeah.
Wine, split up half a bottle with my wife, for example. But it's, yeah. So we're more. I think we're more monitoring of our own health and our own, what we consume, and also our kids. We want to make sure that we're a good role model for them, and I think that's worked out pretty well. So.
Yeah, you definitely see a trend where in the military, especially, there used to be NCO clubs or officer clubs on every post, which were watering holes, essentially, right? And those have largely gone away. And they do have places where you can buy alcohol, obviously, but it's more of a zero defect mentality in the military now. So if you have one alcohol, issue, an alcohol-related incident, that could terminate your career in some respects. Now, when I was in the Marine Corps, I had 2 DUIs, almost back to back, and nothing happened to me at all. It was, I remember I was out in Iwakuni, Japan, my first duty station with the Marines, and our commanding officer, a full-blood colonel, he'd marched us in formation in civilian uniform out in town, out of the gate of the base onto the Japanese town where there's, a bar town that was outside the gate. And he marched us, and then, we weren't allowed to go back to the base until the skipper went back to the base, which he was a raging alcoholic. And so that was, I learned pretty well from him. But for those who did not want to go out drinking with the boys, or, in that case, they were punished. They were given guard duty. They got to watch the flight line. They got to do all the things that, none of us want to do, like stand and watch guard for the barracks or something. So, you learn very quickly. You adapt to that. And now that kind of behavior would not be tolerated in today's military, and rightly so. But, the military has always had a long association, like you said, with tobacco and alcohol. And I think you go back to the American Revolution and the Civil War. I mean, rations of alcohol we use routinely to placate the troops, right? To let them kind of divest or themselves from the trauma of battle.
Didn't work very well, but
well, it didn't end when they left the military either, right? Those problems.
Well, that's what I was thinking. Here in Tallahassee, the main watering hole is the American Legion, and then the VFW is down the street, and that's so you go from the military, you go.
That's right.
And of course, the beer and the wine is less expensive. So.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think that's still true. And like they have on base, it's cheaper to buy alcohol, and so a lot of us will go to base to buy our groceries, including our alcohol, and that's all fine. But in recently, again, we treat it like a recent phenomenon with opioids, pain prescription, right? Like that was unique to this generation, but that problem really hit home during the American Civil War. A lot of people became addicted to opium and morphine, painkillers, and alcohol through the American Civil War, and they left, and the war ended, and people continued their addictive behaviors. And back then, they didn't know as much about it, right, as we do now. But this whole thing with opioid epidemic and the overprescription of opioid painkillers to treat PTSD, as was policy in the VA, apparently. Again, ignoring those lessons. What do you do when you give veterans rampant access to opioids to kill their pain, whether physical or psychological? Is that it doesn't end well?
Doesn't end well.
Doesn't end well.
We still haven't spoken about suicide yet.
No, yeah, well, we haven't, and that's one of those other categories of kind of more of a social behavioral effects of unmet need and military mental health needs is, of course, suicide. That does get a fair amount of public attention, as you know.
Yeah, the thing that is odd about suicide in particular is that I think you actually mentioned when you were saying, well, it's not a diagnosis, but it's it's an activity, and
it's a symptom, or it's a behavior, or it's a manifestation, if you would, of for different reasons why people might choose suicide.
The only experience I've had with suicide affecting a friend of mine or friends, etc., was I'll not say his name, but he was a corpsman and started a very important organization for veterans in San Francisco. But he and I and Shad Meshed and everybody were at the White House, and there was a picture of the three of us, and so that was really great. And then Shad told me a couple years later that he took his life, but I was not surprised at all about that because he was suffering a lot, and he refused to get treatment, as far as I could tell, at least as far as I knew.
Yeah.
So that was really a major, major loss.
Well, I'm sorry, for the loss of your friend.
I sense with regard to the military is the frustration of the failure of getting it and stopping it and changing the dynamic. Any new something else, some program that hasn't been invented yet, needs to happen. I mean, it's just right there.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there is a new program. I mean, the military, through Congress, has invested a lot of money and thrown a lot of money at this problem of suicide in the military and the VA, right? Yeah. It's some really good things, like the crisis lines are available, and they have military life consultants that are contractors that don't write in records, so that people have access in the military to talk to a mental health provider and won't have to worry about it going on their record, that type of stuff. So, and there's been a lot of research, a lot of money thrown at the problems of military suicide, veteran suicide. And one of the things, again, I just get so pissed off when I read researchers and Army experts and others who look at the problem with military suicides, and they conclude that, well, the suicide rates during wartime are not any different than not peacetime. And, they're equivalent to the civilian population, with exceptions of just a couple of periods where the military rate of suicide seems to be above that of the civilian rate. And I'm talking about Harvard researchers and all these other, people from ivory towers, and the military, of course, buys it hook, line, and sinker, that there's no real association. The effects of war or protracted stress is not the reason why there's a higher suicide rate amongst military and veterans. It's bullshit.
That's the thesis these days.
Yeah. But, we look at this in our book, and we talk about, and what I did is I went through newspaper records, like New York Times, for example, and I found after every war there is clusters of suicides during and after the wars. And I remember this is after the First World War, in New York Times, there was one headline that said 400 soldiers commit suicide in New York alone that year. And another headline, I think in 1921 in New York Times, was that 2 suicides a day were being committed by veterans from the First World War. Now that pales in comparison to 22 or 20 a day we see now, right? That's reported, but that's nationwide. This is just one state. That back in that time too, when there wasn't a lot of reporting of mental health and suicide in general. But every war, there's been a problem with suicides, and it is directly related to experiences, not only of being exposed to war stress itself, but just the whole op tempo in the military, even those in support roles who are kind of behind the scenes. There's just a lot going on. There's a lot of pressure and stress on everybody. And unfortunately, the policies of the military are, like the issues around stigma in particular, are what drives these suicide rates high, is that's unmet need, and that people are desperate and they do desperate things.
As I think about it, those of us who were his friend, we were hit pretty hard by that. And I don't know, I think that I've worked it through as far as I could tell, although now I'm not so sure in terms of the emotionality that, it's there, not coming out yet, but it's there. I during the movement to support Vietnam veterans, especially combat veterans, etc. There was an esprit de corps. We were all in it together. We were, trying to push for better services and better understanding. The outreach programs, etc., worked out eventually. But when it hits home, like there was a friend, a colleague, someone that you knew very well, that you didn't suspect of having any kind of problems, that happens. It really hit me hard, at least, because I said, what's wrong with you? You have all these degrees and you weren't able to see in someone who is your friend that close to suicide. And it was, I think that's what bothered me the most, is that I had no idea. And even his closer friends, because they lived in San Francisco, were sure about that. I want to talk about something else, because I didn't think I would do this. There was a colleague and friend who died in 2013, I think it was somewhere in that period of time. He and I worked together on a lot of things, including, papers, etc., presentations in particular. But he had a young family. It's probably a lot like what your experience is, Mark. Young family, beautiful, wonderful wife, great sense of humor that he had. And, it was just an attack, or it was a carrier for troop carrier, but only like 6 or 8. But he was an officer and social worker, and it hit me hard. And a colleague of mine, Jeff, called me and said, about Dave's death. It's very interesting because much of what Dave and I did in terms of our study was sort of figured out in New Orleans. And my sense was that I wouldn't be able to function. I mean, I didn't say that to myself. I just sensed that it would just screw things up so completely. And then knowing how he died in terms of not having any chance whatsoever, it brought the war home to me clearly. And we were I think we were in the second of a 5 or 3 year grant. And I had to sort of carry on myself. Much of it was data analysis, so it wasn't fine. But we were out in the field. We were, collecting data from troops. I was interviewing. He was in the back because he was still in the military. He didn't want to freak people out. But it was just something that I thought I survived. People dying around me.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he died, that was pretty bad. And I think in many ways, it changed me fundamentally. I hadn't really thought about that until this moment, but much more seriously, because he and I would kid around a lot, et cetera, et cetera. And I think I think that was about the time.
Yeah.
Did I talk about this when we were working together? On all this stuff?
I don't remember. You didn't. I think you mentioned something. I know you lost a friend. I think you mentioned something about it, but I didn't know more about it.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
A lot of this is news to me.
Yeah, I think that much of our work together was a carrying on of what
I see.
And it was actually much better because the grant was focusing on studying combat medics, and he and I both really enjoyed it. It was going to be interesting and fun because there was nothing on them. It's really weird why that's the case. And we've also, among other things, found that men and women are very similar in contrast to all other studies. So the male, well, anyway, men and women see things similarly because they're medics. So, but anyway, his death was just, it's part of what you have to deal with, I guess, in this kind of work, because we were, I'd say fairly close, I would say. Has that happened to you when someone took their life? Or
Oh, yeah, I was, as you were saying that, I was thinking of my friend who was an Army psychologist who had a beautiful young family and tragically committed suicide and left a note, and it was very sad and profound about how much we all missed in terms of what was going on with them. And I look back and I kind of look at it as, and maybe we'll get to today or we get to another episode about this compassion fatigue or distress, right? Is that I could see myself I didn't want to know. I had my own, I was way over my head, and I didn't, I think I recognized the signs were there that he was in real trouble, but I didn't want to open up that can of worms. I just didn't know how to deal with it. I don't know if I could handle it. I didn't know if he could, if I was to probe it, and what's going on. And I look back and I just got tremendous guilt for, not having the courage, I guess, to speak to him about it when he was struggling and when there was some evidence that he was not himself. But, other things that come to my mind is, as a military psychologist, I sent many people, hundreds of people, thousands probably, back to the front lines who should not have gone back. And this kind of goes back to, we talked about the mental health dilemma, that the mission of military medicine is to preserve the fighting force. So as psychologists, military psychologists, mental health providers, we're trained, indoctrinated that our primary client is the military. And our secondary client is the military person or their family members, right? But the mission is our primary goal. And the whole thing about combat psychiatry, frontline psychiatry, which we'll talk about in a future episode, is that you return back, again, by policy, about 97% of people who break down are having some emotional difficulties, you send them back, after a short rest and do some interventions or stuff like that. But so I have so many, I feel I have blood on my hands from how many people have I sent back. And then talking to family members who pleaded to me not to let their service member go back. But then them, finding out they were killed, and then, I'm having to now talk to the family members about why we didn't do more to protect their loved one, and et cetera. So it's a lot of what we would call a moral injury, is that kind of acting or not acting in ways that go against our deepest values. In this case, my values conflicted with the values of the military and my obligation as a naval officer or military psychologist, and that as a human being. And so as you're talking, I'm just resonating with all kinds of things swirling into my pitiful head. And we're going to talk about compassion stress later on, maybe, or something, but it all feeds into that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I have focused my energy and attention on caregivers. I mean, the last book was on pandemic providers.
Yeah. And you wrote the first book on compassion fatigue.
Yeah. And it's interesting. A lot of people are not aware of this. I just want to call it secondary traumatic stress, and that's what it is. But the publisher says, compassion fatigue seems far more interesting and far more compelling and all that. So I went with that.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. It was to the publisher already.
Yeah.
traumatic stress. It's
Well, this
like,
whole thing with fatigue, right? I think her name was Carla Johnson in 1992. She coined the term compassion fatigue, and she was an emergency room nurse.
no, she wasn't. Let me tell you about that.
Correct me.
She's a reporter.
Is that right? How did
Yes.
they get in the
Yes.
literature as a nurse?
Well, it was a mistake. I mean, maybe I did that, but
Oh,
yeah, she definitely is
was
not
not a nurse.
spoken to her by phone, and she was a guest in my class. So
Interesting.
yeah. But
Okay.
everything else is correct that you're saying. Yeah,
Yeah. Well,
made
I
it.
don't know if this part is correct, but you tell me too. But supposedly Johnson used the term fatigue because secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma was not accepted by physicians and nurses as being too stigmatizing and perceptions of weakness, etc. But fatigue, just like the military did. Remember, we talked about that transition where they started calling things battle fatigue or combat exhaustion, uh, combat fatigue, fire fatigue. All that was meant to convey the sense that it's universally accepted that most people are going to break down under
Oh. Mhm.
a certain dosage level of traumatic stress, that it's universal.
Mhm.
So it's to normalize that people are going to have some reaction to exposure to stress, but it's short-lived, right? Anything longer than 6 months would have been viewed as either malingering or personality disorder or,
It's a sales job.
well, yeah.
I mean, how can we package this in a way that will be more appealing, or at least won't turn people off initially?
Right. And again, the intention initial may be right. Okay, look, so it's not as stigmatizing. People at least will accept fatigue
Mm.
and will acknowledge they're tired, and they might do something to be more open to get help for that than they would if you tell them it's secondary traumatization or
And
like,
that's what's happening, as it turns out. I monitor the literature daily,
yeah.
and it is evolved from military and from emergency workers
Hmm.
to nurses who work everywhere in the world in all specialties. It's
Mm.
really remarkable, and that then it's now made it into schools and studying how teachers have become, fatigued or whatever we call it,
Right.
the work, etc. But there has been, I think I mentioned this already, there has been a major shift in how compassion fatigue, or at least secondary trauma, or any kind of the focus is on the practitioner. The focus is on those that are providing assistance, trying to heal people.
Right.
Um, I'm very happy about that, but at the same time, I'm co-editing a book on compassion fatigue. It started out, but one of my colleagues, a former student actually, Brian Bride, he suggested it should be compassion fatigue. I'm sorry, secondary trauma,
Uh,
because that's, and I agreed with him. I understand that. But
yeah, that's
it's
right.
going so well. It's moving, it's taking off in terms of compassion fatigue. So,
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen George Carlin's skit on PTSD.
no.
Oh, I'll send it to you. It's hilarious. But of
Well,
course, he's such a master of language, right?
yes.
And communicating. But yeah, I
Seven,
won't still. But go ahead.
the 7 things you can't say on television or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's another skit, right? But he was very humorous, but really making a great point that we used to have direct language to really talk directly about what the issues was, and he was talking about the example of PTSD and you know shell shock, is very direct. It's very clear what's causing the injury, and it's two words, and and then he goes into other examples and ends up with post-traumatic stress disorder, and this very sterile 4 words now or something. And But it was very comical, but really hit to the point. Like, compassion fatigue or battle fatigue or combat exhaustion may be destigmatizing in some ways, but it also actually does reinforce stigma in other ways.
Mm.
It's those of us who are having more than fatigue,
Mm. Yeah.
more and aren't recovering quickly, and
Mm-hmm.
after a bit of respite, what does it mean about us?
Yeah.
Right? And we continue to have some reactions and distress, etc.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Can't argue with you.
can't argue, huh? But did I ever share with you uh, my bout with compassion fatigue?
No.
All right. Well, I'll give the short version of it, and we can talk more on a future
Okay.
episode about it. But this was in the height of my being a military whistleblower and also the only mental health provider on a Marine base of 6,000
6,000 clients.
clients. And then I'm covering two other bases on top of it. So I'm on a pager and a cell phone, getting calls all times of day and night.
Impossible.
Right?
Oh,
Crazy, right?
yeah.
And I was I was talking to my wife and we were living out in town in Japan, in rural Japan, and we had a Japanese house, and I'm laying out there and talking to her and about the day's events. And suddenly I stopped talking, and I suddenly am not responsive anymore. And I'm looking straight ahead. I'm aware, I'm conscious. I cannot move.
Wow.
I'm paralyzed. I am mute. I cannot speak. I can hear what's going on. My vision became very black and tunnel, but I could still see. But the sounds, like my sounds of my wife, my kids crying, it was like being underwater. It was muffled. So I'm getting some perceptions, but not that. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, I'm having a stroke.
Yeah.
I might be gone. This might be it. And a part of me is saying, thank God.
Oh man.
Right. I
Oh.
mean, just to be honest. And then I hear my children crying, my wife, and I'm thinking, okay, no, this isn't the time to go. The Japanese EMTs are called. They come into my house and they lift me onto a gurney. And again, I'm immobilized. Right. I go to the ER and I'm getting CAT scans, MRIs, EKGs, EEGs, all that other stuff. And they can't find a single thing wrong with me. Right. Medically unexplained. They diagnose it as idiopathic seizure, which means they don't know what it is. Right? It's unexplained.
Yeah.
So that was my first real understanding that psychosomatic is real. Hysteria is real. You can call it whatever you want.
Right.
Medically unexplained, whatever. But it felt every bit real. I was motivated to get up and speak. I did not choose that. I wasn't trying to get out of combat. I wasn't trying to get, malinger for a pension. I was no pension neurosis. It was me succumbing to the effects of chronic stress. And I was exhibiting these medically unexplained psychosomatic symptoms, right? But it was really the compassion stress from all the things that I've seen and heard, all the stories that we all do, that led to my friend Peter's suicide as an Army psychologist. He could not take it anymore, wasn't able to process it anyway, meaningful. And so that, for me, made compassion fatigue. I get irritated with that term because I was not just tired, I was injured.
Yeah.
There was something in my brain that changed, that switch flipped off. And if
Well,
if it can affect you that real in that way, it's more than just fatigue.
speaking of that, what happened after that? I mean, did you slowly recover?
I did. I recovered fairly quick as far as my capacity to speak and move. It took about, I don't know, 5 or 6 hours in the ICU, and then I recovered my functions, right?
Wow.
Then I wasn't allowed to drive for 3 months, and I had to go through a little post-neurological and medical workups, and they couldn't find anything again to explain it, other than the fact that I had lost probably 50, 60 pounds in the 4 years I was there under that stress. And I'll share with you a photo later on that would show you a skeleton of a person that,
Is you weren't lifting weights?
oh, I had no weightlifting. I wasn't sleeping, obviously. I wasn't eating. I mean, it wasn't a mystery to me why I succumbed the way I did, but it was the protracted chronic stress that was literally killing me. And I allowed it in a way and welcomed it in some ways.
Yes. May have saved your life.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, in a way, it did wake me up, and then it caused me to pull back, and I had to cut down a lot of my clinical hours because I was working 6 days a week in the clinic, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. were my hours. And then I'm on pager watch, right? So that didn't change, being the only credentialed mental health provider for that base. So.
And two others.
Yeah, too. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. But that's why, again, I think compassion stress, and you look at caretakers, and there's millions of them, of wounded warriors who now become professional caretakers and had to be for their wounded son, daughters, husband, wives, fathers.
If our podcast does nothing but educate people about this in particular,
Yeah.
great service, I think.
I hope so. I hope by learning our lessons, things that we've done well, but also more importantly, our mistakes, and that that it opens the door for people to consider that their situation's not a lot different, and we're two mental health professionals supposedly, and yet we both talked about in these last two episodes our vulnerabilities and our humanity, and I know we're just scratching the surface on that, but more to come, I guess.
There will be, yes. And I'm glad we are. And we have the wherewithal to talk about it and to move on whenever we're needed, if we need to.
Yeah.
It was a good session.
Okay. Well, I see that we're kind of at our time for the episode. So we thank everybody who listened to this. And then again, if you wish to contact Charles or myself, please email me at mrussellphd@gmail.com, and we'll get to your comments and anything else that comes up in future shows.
Great. See you later.